2 Samuel 23, and then also, if you would, go to 1 Chronicles chapter 11. 2 Samuel 23, and then 1 Chronicles chapter 11 as well. Let's look here in 2 Samuel 23, and we'll notice here in verse 8. These be the names of the mighty men whom David had. The Tachmonite that sat in the seat, chief among the captains. The same was Adino the Eznite. He lifted up his spear against 800 whom he slew at one time. Now some believe that the one who was copying this, because this here is copied somewhat from Chronicles as well. Some believe that Chronicles actually has a more direct statement on this in this passage here, and that's why we'll go to 1 Chronicles chapter 11 as well. But then it goes on to say in verse 9, and after him was Eleazar, the son of Dodo, the Ohahite. And of course, these are interesting names, but it says one of the three mighty men with David. Now, this passage here in 2 Samuel 23, in that part, and also 1 Chronicles 11, is going to talk about these mighty men. There were many with David in leadership. And again, David, we know, was a great man of God, but he was also a great warrior. But it wasn't just simply David by himself. David had a lot of other mighty men that were with him, very powerful, and fought with him and were faithful. And so we're going to look at them as well. We notice here in 1 Chronicles in chapter 11, keep your place there in 2 Samuel 23, but then in 1 Chronicles chapter 11, in verse 11 or in verse 10, it says, these also are the chief of the mighty men whom David had, who strengthened themselves with him in his kingdom. Of course, in verse 9, it states, David waxed greater and greater, for the Lord of hosts was with him. Now that ultimately, we understand God was with him, and that is why David grew and was mighty. Again, because he sought his strength in God. But we also understand that he had this team with him of mighty soldiers that fought with him. And so again, this is why it's stated here in verse 11 or in verse 10, it says that they strengthened themselves with him in his kingdom. So again, I look at this almost just as the passage there in Proverbs. It talks about iron sharpening iron. They helped each other out. They strengthened one another. And so at this time where David is fleeing from Saul, but also they are fighting the Philistines, we see that this is recorded, some of the mighty acts that takes place in their lives. Now, not much is said about the soldiers that were with David, but we are going to look at some of that there. In 1815, the British Army tried to conquer Nepal, but it was easily defeated by the warriors in Nepal, and they were known as the Gurkhas. So the British officers decided not to try to fight them again. They actually decided if they couldn't beat them, that they were going to get them to join them. And of course, that's what did take place. There was a peace agreement, and so during that time, the Gurkhas actually chose to fight alongside and help the British. And they fought. The Gurkhas fought in several wars. They fought in World War I, World War II. They fought also in the Falklands War. But they were known for years. These individuals there, warriors in Nepal, were known to be just, again, mighty soldiers. In fact, some of the stories that go, one of them in 1945, they're known as some of the bravest in the world. Really, in 1945, there was a rifleman named Lachiman Gurung, and he was stationed in a trench with only two other men. Of course, there was over 200 Japanese soldiers that had opened fire on that trench. The two men ended up becoming severely wounded. Grenades were being thrown into the trench, and so Gurung actually would grab the grenades and take them and try to throw them back out. He managed successfully to throw two of the grenades, but one ended up blowing his right hand off, basically, and scarring and marring his face and injuring him. But what happened was, when the Japanese stormed the trench, He didn't give up. He actually wielded his rifle, and he killed 31 of them with his left hand. He prevented them from advancing, and of course, he ended up surviving that. And he was awarded the Victoria Cross later that year. Of course, it didn't happen just then in 1945. Many years later, in 2010, it's recorded in Afghanistan, there was an acting sergeant. The name was Diprazad Pun. Single-handedly, he fought off 30 Taliban soldiers, it's stated. He was keeping guard on a roof at a checkpoint, and the attackers came at the complex from all sides with rocket-propelled grenades and AK-47s. It took less than an hour for Pun to kill them all. And of course, he went through his ammunition, 400 rounds, it says, and 17 grenades as well. And one attacker that came at him, he had nothing else left. He ended up throwing the machine gun tripod that he was using and hit the attacker and hurt him. And so he was awarded as well by the British military. And then it doesn't stop with just simply their service and then they retire and that's it. In 2011, there was a retired Gurkha. His name was Vishnu Shrestha. He was riding a train in India. There were 40 robbers apparently on this train. They began stealing passengers' belongings. And of course, this retired soldier had a knife with him at all times. It was one he used in battle. But he ended up taking on the armed. Of course, these robbers had their own swords and knives and pistols. But he managed to kill 3 of them and injure 8 others. And he ended up persuading all the others to flee. And so they ran and fled. And then he also saved another passenger later on that time. So it's interesting to see. And of course, there are stories galore of different soldiers in the battle that is committed to bravery. And in the face and against all odds, they stood firm. And so that's what we're looking at here. And what we notice here in 1 Chronicles in chapter 11, in verse 11, it says here, notice 1 Chronicles chapter 11 and verse 11. And this is the number of the mighty men whom David had. Joshabim, a Hakamonite, the chief of the captains, he lifted up his spear against 300 slain by him at one time. Now some believe, well, the other writer there in Samuel, 2 Samuel, they may have copied over and they may have missed some of the Hebrew wording. Others say, well, really, they were just talking about somebody else because they're trying to figure out. There was an individual, apparently it seems like, that killed 800 and another one that ended up killing 300. Well, here in Chronicles it states that there were 300 that were killed. And then when you go on, it says here in verse 12, and after him was Eleazar, the son of Dodo, the Ohite, who was one of the 3 mighties. He was with David at Pashdamon, and there the Philistines were gathered together to battle. There was a parcel of ground full of barley, and the people fled from before the Philistines. Now that's the account that you have here. He fought alongside with David. There were many Philistines, and again, they were in this field. And I wouldn't say they were necessarily protecting the barley, but the Philistines were known to come in and burn many of the fields and burn their crops and to try to basically cause a famine in the land to defeat the Israelites. But they ended up defending against that. Well, in 2 Samuel, what it says here, notice in 2 Samuel, in chapter 23, in verse 9, because it gives a little more information about what Eleazar did. 2 Samuel 23 in verse 9. And after him was Eleazar, the son of Dodo, the Ohite, one of the 3 mighty men with David, when they defied the Philistines that were gathered together to battle, and the men of Israel were gone away. Now that's something you notice right from the get-go, is that David, it was only him and David. They fought alongside each other. Others left, ran away. They said it's hopeless. So we notice that from the beginning here. They stood their ground and they fought. And what is interesting here is when you look in verse 10, it says he arose. Eleazar arose and smote the Philistines until his hand was weary. Now, That part there, when you read it, you could read that until his hand was weary, then it gave way and he gave up. But that's not what happened, is it? What happened was he fought so long, so hard, his hand became so tired, but he clung onto that sword. He clung onto his weapon so tightly. It says here his hand clave to the sword. And the idea of this is it's almost that it glued itself to his hand could not. Now, I've experienced this, and I'm sure many of you have, when you have weed eaten for any significant time in your life. Now, if you haven't, you may not know. But if you do it for hours on end, I used 2 years ago have to weed eat for 7 hours straight. Wasn't a fun thing. And one of the things that would happen is that eventually your body's just kind of trembling, but your hands are getting gnarled, and you're just walking around like this. It's just however you position your hands on that weed eater, that's how it winds up throughout the day. It takes a good while for it to, how many has experienced that? You know, maybe it's not a weed eater, but something like that, and you've experienced that. Now, it doesn't take as long now for me to experience that, but years ago, it took a good while for me to weed eat and experience that. But your hands, they just get to this point, and you kind of that's the way it is. And after a little while, of course, hopefully it kind of settles down and everything else, but you still kind of sometimes it's like this. I try to make sure after I get done weed eating, don't go home and grab you a glass. Don't do that. But again, this is in this sense is that he's weary, he's tired, and yet he's not going to give up in the midst of this. He clings onto that sword and he continues to the point that it's just glued to his hand, and he can't let it go. That's it. It's almost like it's become a part of him. He won't give up. And so this is what we see about Eleazar. So the question is, what do we do when weakness sets in? Because yes, what happens oftentimes when we go through problems and struggles and the weakness begins to set in, we get tired at times, we want to give up. And for some people, that's it. When it's just a little bit of hardship, that's it. They tuck tail and they run and they give up. But it doesn't happen here to Eleazar. He continues. He presses through. And of course, we've heard many times, ones will say, no pain, no what? No gain. And so, yeah, that may be cliche in that sense, but the reality is that when in the midst of that struggle, when we are tried, and how we press on. Now, I'm not going to stand here and tell you, well, you've got to do it in your power. You better fight hard. But because we know that here we already read that David was mighty because he was mighty in the Lord. God was with him. So that really we have to understand foremost, it's not about simply you having to fight. It's about allowing God working through your life, being yielded to him and being faithful. So look with me in 2 Corinthians chapter 12. Notice this, and it's a very familiar passage, but in 2 Corinthians in chapter 12. Notice what Paul states here in 2 Corinthians in chapter 12 in verse 7. 2 Corinthians 12 and verse 7. Paul says, and lest I should be exalted above measure. Now the reality is Paul, it's not that he's trying to brag about all the things in his life, but what has happened with the church at Corinth is they've beginning to listen to all these other speakers who have no experience. They really don't care about the gospel, but they come in and they say, well, we've got this kind of degree and we know more than Paul. Paul's weak. Paul's been beaten many times, and Paul, he doesn't speak too well. He's too long of a speaker, by the way. And, they just, the church of Corinth begin to kind of turn against Paul in a sense. They don't see all the efforts that Paul has done and how God has used Paul. And so Paul is letting them know many things that he has experienced. And yet he says, I'm not going to boast in those things. He says, the reality, I could boast, I could brag, I could present my own list of experiences. But again, he tells them as well in chapter 11, he tells them many of the things that he faced. But in this, he's not trying to brag. He's letting them know. You have ones that you're listening to, they're not willing at all to ever suffer or face any kind of hardship in life to present you the gospel. They're there to rob you. They're there to extort you. But again, that's another way it goes many times, and people willing in that. And Paul, here he says, I have faced so many things to present the gospel, to be a witness. But Paul says in verse 7 of chapter 12, unless I should be exalted above measure, through the abundance of the revelations, there was given to me a thorn in the flesh. So again, Paul says that the revelations that have been given to me, the reality is that in this, I could brag, I could boast, but it's not necessary in that. The reality is that lest I end up becoming prideful for the things that I've received, the experiences that I've had. He says what was given to me was a thorn in the flesh. For Paul to say that, the idea is this splinter in the flesh. Something that is pricking his body continually, hurting him. Some say, well, it must have been a physical malady. Some believe, well, it must have been something with Paul's eyesight. Others say maybe it was an emotional thing. Maybe we don't fully know. But something to the degree that Paul said in verse 8, I sought the Lord 3 times that it would depart from me. And he said to me, 3 times Paul prayed, and he begged of God that whatever he was suffering, whatever a malady in his life, he seeks for God to take that away 3 times. But he says here, Christ said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. It's in the weak times when you really can experience his power. And Paul says, I understand now that I ought to rejoice in the weak times, because really it's those times when it's one thing when you're on the mountaintop and everybody sees and says, wow, he's so strong, he's so wonderful. But when you're in the valley, when you're in the pit, what do you do at that time when you go through the weakness of life? Do you give up? Do you finally say, well, I just forget it. It's not worth it anymore to follow the Lord. It's not worth it. Paul says, the reality is that Christ, his strength is perfect in my weakness. And notice what he says, most gladly, therefore will I rather glory in my infirmities. And the infirmities is weaknesses. I would rather glory in the weaknesses, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. Therefore I take pleasure. He says I'm well pleased when I go through problems. Now, I don't think we're to that point and that degree where we're just so thrilled when bad things happen. But this is where Paul is he says, I realize something. If it is in the weaknesses and the weekdays that I turn to God and I say, God, I can't do it, but you can. And he does a mighty work, and he says, my power is sufficient. And it teaches me to trust him. Then guess what? I'm the better for it. And I'll rejoice. Now we've kind of changed it a little bit, haven't we? Instead of saying, why me? You've come to the point where you say, God, teach me, help me to grow. So this is where he is. So the question, what do we do in the midst of the weaknesses? Paul says that I take pleasure in infirmities and reproaches and necessities and persecutions and distresses for Christ's sake. Now that is key. We may go through suffering because of the sins that we've committed, because of the bad decisions. But Paul is saying, I rejoice if I'm doing these things for the sake of Jesus Christ. And I'm seeking his will, and yet I go through the hardship, I rejoice because God knows, he knows, and he'll give me the strength to go through it. For when I am weak, then am I strong. That's interesting. Paul, you sound like a lunatic. But he's saying when I'm physically, when I weak in my life, the reality is that I am spiritually strong. I receive this divine strength from God Almighty. So again, we notice this about Eleazar. Eleazar, he fought, and he fought valiantly, and in times of weakness, he did not give up. He continued and pressed forward at the point to where his sword clave to him and basically glued itself to his hand. And we notice in verse 10, it says, the Lord wrought a great victory here in 2 Samuel 23. The Lord wrought a great victory that day. Now that's the wonderful thing about it. You're going to notice over and over in these passages, it doesn't say they wrought the great victory. No, God is the one that wrought the great victory. He is the one that gets the glory. But we notice again, the Lord wrought a great victory that day. And it says here, and the people returned after Eleazar only to the spoil. So what did they do? You know, I think about it like the fable of the red hen, the little red hen what is the red hen? Well, she's baking. She's going to, in the fable, she's supposed to get all these ingredients and things from the garden and try to bake bread. And you know, wonderful, some stories is a cake or something like that. But she goes to the different farm animals and asks them for help. Of course, I also look at times, it's sadly the reality of church life at times. She goes, she asks for help here. And they say, no, I don't have time, can't help you. The red hen goes to another farm animal. No, I can't help you. No, I don't want to help. And then finally, she ends up making it herself. And everybody starts smelling the sweet aroma of that bread. Oh, man. And everybody wants a piece. Everybody wants to come. And she said, no, you can't. You didn't help. You weren't part of it. Now it's a simple story. But we notice here, Eleazar, everybody leaves. And it's Eleazar, it's David. And he's fighting hard. And it's only whenever they're gone and the battle's done that, guess what happens? Everybody wants to come back and get all the spoil. Then there's another individual we see here in this passage. In verse 11. And after him was Shammah, the son of Agi, the Hararite. And the Philistines were gathered together into a troop. They were gathered and they were all unified at this point to fight. And it says here, where there was a piece of ground full of lentils, and the people fled from the Philistines. So again, what we have here is, some believe this is at the same time. But you might have had Eleazar off in one field, and David is with him. Shammah is in another place trying to protect this other field. He's by himself. Not a single soul is around him. Notice it says here in verse 12, everybody flees except for Shammah. And he stood in the midst of the ground and defended it. And he slew the Philistines, and the Lord wrought a great victory. So therein lies again. The question is, what do we do when weakness sets in? And the other question is, what do we do when it seems like no one else is there? When it seems like no one else is there. Even Elijah ran away and hid at one point, begging for his life to be over, because he believed he was alone in serving the Lord. If you remember that, he said, God, it's enough. Just kill me, God. No one else is serving you. Nobody else. And God had to remind Elijah there were thousands that had not bowed their knee to Baal. So it may seem like at times that there's nobody else. Shammah, that's at that point. Eleazar, at the very least, had David with him. Shammah, nobody. And everyone is run. Wherever he was and what he's experiencing, everybody else flees, but he stands right in the middle and faces it head on. And so what do we do when it seems like no one else will? We have the attitude, well, that's their job. You know, I can't do it myself. Well, I mean, I'd do it if so-and-so would do it. I'd do it if they would do it. What do we do when God calls us to reach out, witness? Again, there's a reason I understand when Jesus sent the disciples out 2 by 2. You needed to have one to come along and help and aid. What happens whenever it's just you? No one else is looking, no one else is watching. And by the way, Shammah could have run and tucked tail just like everybody else. But he didn't. He stood his ground in the midst of him. And then we go on further, and we notice this as well in verse 13. And 3 of the 30 chief went down and came to David in the harvest time into a cave of Adullam. And the troop of the Philistines pitched in the valley of Rephaim. And David was then in a hold. Now this is believed he was in a cave area in that place. But David here, he says, "Oh, that one would give me drink of water of the well of Bethlehem, which is by the gate." How far the Philistines had encamped and basically set a place where it seemed to be impossible. Nobody would ever take a chance to go in that area to get water from that well. It's certain death. David says, "Oh, I wish they were not there. I wish I could just get a drink of water from the well of Bethlehem." And what do these three mighty men do? Now, we're not given names. Some believe that it may have been Eleazar and Shammah, and others stated we really don't fully know. But they go. They actually go. David doesn't command them in this, but they go. What do we do when the odds are stacked against us? When the task seems impossible? Well, they went. Three mighty men broke through the host of the Philistines, and they drew water out of the well that was by the gate, and they took it, and they brought it to David. Now, I read this years ago, and for the first time when I was a kid, and I thought to myself, man, David was really mean, because what do? They fought, they did all of this, they bring it back, and David pours it to the ground. But David, the thing is that he realizes the selfishness. One, he never asked them in that. Isn't it wonderful to know that whenever people do something, they don't have to be asked? Something needs done, they just do it. They don't have to be asked. They're not asked, but David's just saying, crying out, "Oh, I wish I could get through." And they said, "You know what? Let's go and get that for him. Let's get him a cup of water." And so they go. It seems utterly impossible, and yet they beat down the Philistines. They take the cup of water. They take it to him. And David, though, he says, "There's no way that I can drink this." He says, you have risked your life. And this, if I drink this is like your own blood of what you risked. So he pours it out. He says, "I can't do that." So again, what do we do when there's nobody else? And what do we do when the task seems impossible? When it seems impossible. And then we go on further. We notice it says in verse 18, "And Abishai, the brother of Joab, the son of Zeruiah, was chief among three. He lifted his spear against 300 and slew them, and had the name among three. Was he not the most honorable of the three? Therefore he was their captain, howbeit he attained not unto the first three." And what it's simply stating is that he wasn't included in that first three of the mighty men, but he was as honorable, and he fought honorably and valiantly. And then we notice here in verse 20, "And Benaiah, the son of Jehoiada, the son of a valiant man of Kabzeel, who had done many acts, he slew 2 lion-like men of Moab." And again, the state, in that sense, when it talks about lion-like, these are large, strong warriors that he fought against. And he says he slew them. And then we notice it says he went down also and slew a lion in the midst of a pit in time of snow. He kills a lion. He's in a pit. And some believe that actually he was in there. It was almost like a cave shape that he's seeking shelter from the snow. But while he's in there, in that pit, there's a lion with him. It doesn't snow that often in Israel. In some of the mountainous plains and regions, it'll snow. But it's uncommon in many of the places. And this area, it was uncommon. But it wasn't impossible for it to snow. And so at this point, it begins to snow. Something that's unexpected. And even more than that, then he goes and he finds a place. He's in a pit. And there he's either sheltering from the snow or winds up in that pit. But there he finds a lion as well in that pit. And that also was uncommon. And yet, he ends up killing the lion. And why is this stated? Well, I look at it as the unexpected. What do we do when the unexpected happens in life? We were not able to be here, most of you know, we weren't able to be here for Sunday school. We're getting ready. It's about 9 o'clock. And then me and Stephanie were actually in the room that I built not long ago. We call it my bear room, the decorations and everything else. But we're in there. We don't hear. But the washing machine is backed up and it's just spewing water all over the floor. It didn't drain. So there's a piece that's messed up inside the machine. It's not the drain itself. But we don't know. I mean, it's just there's about 2 inches of water in the kitchen and all over the place. So, she gets up, she goes in. I just start hearing her screaming. And I'm thinking, what is going on, And I thought at first she just saw a roach, But that, because the children, for a while, they've been seeing the roaches. Roach, kill it. No, it was worse than that. And so I go in, and of course, you see water everywhere and everything else. And we had to call for the Wayne or let them know that we're not going to be able to be here for the Sunday school time. And so I spent an hour mopping the floors. And that was unexpected. And it's not fun. And many of you have experienced that. You're ready, you're getting prepared, and then all of a sudden, that's it. Change of plans, right? Change of plans. Not a huge thing, but there's other times when we face the unexpected. And it's far worse. Far worse. Now, again, when little things happen like that, and I guess I really messed myself up because yesterday I helped Brother Harold with getting down this little metal building. And I said, it worked so well. I said, Murphy must be on vacation. And I think Murphy heard me and said, we'll see what happens. I even said something about it went so well, Murphy's going to have to work double time. I mean, my goodness. Be quiet. The unexpected. What do we do in the midst of that? Where are you, God? Why? I try to follow you, Lord. When the unexpected happens, are we ready to face it in faith, in full faith that God is going to give us the strength to overcome? In a time of snow, the lion attacks in a pit. He's not in the best location. It's not in the best time. And he's facing a very powerful enemy, and yet he slays it. He's ready. He's eager and ready. Even when the unexpected. I've heard at times where people say, expect the unexpected. Sometimes I think it's a little ridiculous because when you're expecting it, it's never unexpected. But again, I get it. We don't know what happens tomorrow. We don't know. We're not promised. But the reality is that, guess what? When you face those things, understand that God did not bring it in your life to crush you. God is bigger than that. You've got to be ready and say, Lord, I don't know what's going to happen, but God, I know you're in control. The devil wants you to buckle under the pressure. He wants you to face weakness. He wants you to say, oh, it's just too hard. I can't do it anymore. Well, you can't. God can. Spent 2 years seeing that kind of attitude. No. God is bigger. In fact, what happens here is that you notice it doesn't just talk about Benaiah fighting the lion, but it says here in verse 21, and he slew an Egyptian, a goodly man. But really in Chronicles it says the Egyptian was very tall. He was about 8 to 9 feet tall. And it says here that the Egyptian had a spear in his hand, but he went down to him with a staff. Well, I'm not an expert in warfare, but a staff and a spear, it would seem like he'd have something a little better than just a staff. Well, what does he do? He goes down with a staff and he pulls the spear out of the Egyptian's hand and kills him with his own spear. So he's ready. He has a ready defense. He has a bold offense. I mean, he just charges right then and there and takes it from him. I began with talking about the Gurkhas. There, I'll end with that. There's another story about these fighters in Nepal. in 1964. And the thing is that these fighters were asked to jump from airplanes into combat against the Indonesians. The Gurkhas really didn't understand what was involved, though. But they bravely said they'd do it. They'd do it. But they said, look, when we get over there and we're jumping out of the planes, could you just fly about 100 feet high in the air and over maybe some marshland or something? And they said, what are you talking about? They said, if we do that, your parachutes, you won't have time to open your parachutes. And they said, oh, we didn't know you were talking about parachutes. I mean, they were willing to jump out 100 feet high and hope that maybe they'd stick some landing and get in a place maybe of some water or something and survive it and then go fight. Boy, to have that kind of faith and bravery as a Christian. Not because of who we are, but because of who he is. To trust. And I wonder, would my name have been there as well? Of course, there's a long list that it gives. But we learn from this. What do we do when things seem impossible? What do we do when the unexpected happens? What do we do when it seems like no one else is there? And what do we do when weakness sets in? Well, I hope that we will press forward and be strong in the power of his might in the midst of that. But let's pray this morning.